Right, you like listening to the radio in your car, right? But when did that start? When did we get radios in cars? Well, there's a case to be made that this 1931 Studebaker is where it all began. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. This is a great collection. More than 180 cars that really span the full automotive spectrum. And this 1931 Studebaker, it's a Model 70 Commander, tells a pretty important story. Part of it involves automotive survival. You see, in the early 1930s, car companies were desperately trying to figure out how to survive. From getting record sales in the mid to late 20s, they were now struggling to find buyers who still had money. In fact, there were plenty of car companies that did not even survive the Depression. But another part involves automotive innovation. In this case, in this car, the car radio. Something we take for granted today, but it broke new ground back in the early 30s. Now, before we talk too much about this Studebaker and radios, make sure you like and subscribe, and let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And don't forget to tell me your Studebaker stories. Plus, I'd love to hear your car radio stories. What kind of memories does music in an automobile bring back to you? All right, before we talk too much about this 1931 Studebaker and radios, we need to give a very brief history of Studebaker. The company's origins date back to 1852, when the Studebaker brothers, Henry, Clement, John, Peter, and Jacob Studebaker, began building horse-drawn wagons. They were doing it in South Bend, Indiana. And by the 1870s, the company had grown into one of the largest wagon manufacturers in the United States. But in 1902, the company built its first automobile. In fact, over the next decade, Studebaker would build a variety of electric vehicles. But in 1904, they also started turning out gas-powered cars. The early Studebakers were initially hand-built, and they were luxury priced. They wanted to leverage Studebaker's reputation for quality craftsmanship from all their wagon building. During the 1920s, Studebaker expanded its product line. They were gradually moving towards larger, more powerful cars. In 1928, Studebaker introduced its first straight-eight engine in the President model, marking a major engineering milestone for the company. But just when things were starting to hum along, the stock market crashed, and the Depression had begun. From 1929 to 1931, Studebaker faced a very difficult period. In 1929, Studebaker was still operating as a full-line manufacturer. They had the President, the Commander, and the Dictator models. I'm not sure why they ever thought Dictator was a good name. But the stock market crash in October triggered a sharp decline in demand. By 1930, the company, they were trying to continue updating their lineup with better engineering, better styling, and they continued to build that straight-eight engine in their senior models while attempting to maintain production volume by expanding their lines. And this car right here, this 1931 Studebaker Commander, was part of that effort to appeal to more buyers. This was really what's called a mid-sized car back in those days. They had less expensive offerings, they had more expensive, but this was designed to appeal to a broader collection. People who still wanted something nicer, but couldn't afford those big, expensive luxury cars. This was designed to broaden the appeal for folks who wanted a Studebaker. But let's get to the fun part, the car radio. Cars and radios actually share a pretty similar timeline. Both were being developed in the late 1800s. And I have to think that once people began to hear music from a box, they also began to dream about putting that box in their newfangled car. There were several attempts in the 1920s. Some, they were pretty wild looking. After all, radios weren't that small, and they were pretty fragile with those glass tubes. Chevy tried it in 1922, but to be honest with you, I think that was really just an experiment. It appears that the first patent for a modern car radio belongs to a man named William Heine. And I'll talk more about that guy in a minute because he is a very, very fascinating individual. Heine started the U.S. Heinephone Company. His car radios were called transitones, and it wasn't long before Heine sold his company, and it was later bought out by a company called the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, which we know by its shorter name, Philco. You remember that. In those early years, transitone radios weren't sold by the factory. Dealers installed them. And there were plenty of radios that were being sold to retrofit older cars. I believe we have a transitone, a Philco, right here in this museum car. likely one of the earliest car radios ever made. What made this 1931 Studebaker Commander unique was that it was pre-wired for radio. The electrical was already in place. The antenna was built into the car. I should also mention that Motorola lays claim to building the first commercial car radio. I mean, after all, its name is literally a cross between motor and Victrola. Car radios weren't cheap back in those days. I've seen plenty of ads for $99 radios, which, when you figure a car would cost between $500 to $1,000, that was pretty significant. And no doubt they didn't sound that great, but it was a start. And the idea of listening to music as you drove or parked, well, it was on its way into the mainstream. Within just a few years, radios were factory installed, and guess what? They'd be a lot cheaper. And right here on our museum car, we have a Philco Transitone, likely one of the earliest car radios ever made. By the way, William Heine was a pretty interesting guy. Born in what was then Russia, he came to the US with his parents in 1892. As a young man, he started racing, and he even took part of the very first race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway back in 1909. Next, he took up flying and survived a mid-air crash in his monoplane. His next adventure, the Heine Tire Company. But his biggest adventure was likely his trip aboard the ill-fated Lusitania, which was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915. After 4 hours in the water, he was rescued, but not before he helped to save some others. Eventually, he came back to the US, turned his creative mind to radios, and his first patents laid the foundation for the automotive audio that we enjoy today. You know what? Someone needs to write a book about this guy. Let's walk around and take a look at the styling of our 1931 Studebaker, and there were some pretty significant changes in the Studebaker world that year. And we're going to start up front by talking about this grille. In previous years, it had been basically a flat grille like everybody else was doing, but in 1931, they kind of came up with this V look. It had a little bit more of a bow up top. I like how it goes through this Brightwork emblem right here, that lovely Studebaker emblem. Brightwork continues down, and it bows out even more with a more pronounced V look at the bottom. And then, of course, there's those spectacular oval headlights, big, huge things. I think they were even twin beams, so they really stood out, and they looked different than everything else everybody had on the road. Don't call these turn signals. I think they call those parking lights. But once again, what a great design element. Look how that glass kind of curves down inside there. So really, really nice look overall in terms of the way they changed it. This was a 124-inch wheelbase, and they actually added 4 inches this year. And I think a lot of that was actually up front because of much bigger overhang, as you can see right there. I don't think in the Commander series they offered any open top cars, no roadsters, no convertibles. I think they were all closed top. You could get things like the Brougham, the Coupe, the Victoria. You could get a Regal sedan or a regular sedan. So everything was designed to keep you out of the rain. We get to the back of the car, and well, here we have a 1955 Chevrolet, and that is, of course, what we call the trunk, right? Well, there's a reason we call it the trunk, because back in these days, back in 1931, you didn't have something that was a component of the car to put your luggage in. You actually had a trunk that was on the back of the car. And I will tell you, the one we have here at the museum is just spectacular. Look at this custom-made piece of luggage. 4 pieces that actually fit directly into this with just a little bit of extra space up above. So this was a custom work that was done somewhere along the line. I'm not sure who built it or why, but boy, what a great piece of kit that's on the back of this car. Up above, of course, you did not have full stamped steel tops of the car for a long time. I think Chevy with the turret top would be the first to really start doing those. If you bought a Commander, you did get safety glass up front. But interestingly, you did not get safety glass throughout the rest of the car. I think you had to buy their top of the line for the Commander series, which was the Regal, before you got safety glass all around. But overall, great styling, nice long look, nice and comfortable. And once again, those oval headlights up front with that V-shaped grille that really added a lot of style for 1931. In 1930, the year before this car, you had an option to get either a 6-cylinder or an 8-cylinder for your Commander. But for 1931, Studebaker doubled down on the 8s. The only engine that the Commander offered was a 250 cubic inch inline 8-cylinder engine that made 101 horsepower. But that was about 20 horsepower more than the Dictator model, which had about 80 or so in their inline 8. Studebaker's straight 8 history actually goes back to 1928. That's when the company introduced its first inline 8-cylinder engine in the Studebaker President. Prior to that, all Studebaker cars throughout the 1920s were 6 cylinders, right? They had the light 6, the special 6, and the big 6. They were rugged, but they were less refined. And as speeds increase, well, the 1931 straight 8 on this Commander really offered smoother operation and higher horsepower than the 6 cylinders. Even though this engine was actually about the same displacement as the 6. Had a 9-bearing counterbalance crankshaft. It also had better carburation, better manifold, and advertisements back then proclaimed that the engine was uncannily silent, thanks to a carburetor silencer. In fact, they claim it reduced 90% of the motor roar. Those same ads touted the fact that this engine had an air filter, an oil filter, and a gas filter. How bold! By the way, Studebaker did not introduce its first V8 until 1951, which was after Cadillac and Oldsmobile had brought their overhead valve V8s to the market. But what made Studebaker's strategy unique back in 1931 was the fact that it was willing to offer an advanced, smooth-running 8-cylinder engine in its mid-range cars like this Commander. The 1931 Studebaker Model 70 Commander wasn't just another car. It was Studebaker's answer to one of the toughest markets in automotive history. And the idea of wiring it for that fancy new radio helped it appeal to an upscale buyer who wanted a little bit more. Studebaker built nearly 96,000 cars in 1931. About 10,000 of those were these Commanders. Of course, that number was a lot smaller than Ford and Chevrolet, which both sold more than 600,000 cars apiece. Which leads to an interesting question. By hanging on to the mid-range car and not focusing more on the entry-level cars during those tough economic times, did that help Studebaker survive, or did it prevent the company from getting a bigger slice of the automotive pie during the Depression of the 1930s? Because after World War II, Studebaker started to fade. They didn't have enough market share, which meant they weren't making enough money to invest in the kind of post-war innovation that other companies were doing. And as a result, in 1966, Studebaker closed for good. Still, for a time, this 1931 Studebaker Commander stood tall, giving those who could afford a little more the chance to step out in style with a car that was wired for radio.